I will not begin with a story about old age. I will begin with youth, because that is where old age is secretly decided. At 97 years old, I have lived long enough to see the quiet mathematics of the human body. I have seen friends who were strong at 30 become fragile at 60. I have seen men who ignored small signals of imbalance later struggle with diseases they once believed belonged only to other people. And I have also seen the opposite. Ordinary individuals who practiced simple, disciplined habits early in life and arrived at old age with a kind of steady strength that medicine alone could not give them. This is not coincidence. It is biology unfolding across time. When you are young, your body feels forgiving. It absorbs excess, compensates for neglect, and recovers quickly from strain. You can sleep too little, eat too much sugar, ignore movement, and still wake up feeling capable. Youth creates an illusion of biological invincibility. I remember believing that myself. I believed the future would somehow take care of itself. But the truth is that the future is not something that arrives suddenly. It is something you quietly construct, cell by cell, habit by habit, day after day. The body is not a machine that simply runs until it breaks. It is a living system that adapts to every repeated signal you give it. In my 20s, I began to notice something subtle. The men who treated their bodies with respect did not always look extraordinary in the moment. They were not necessarily the fastest, the richest, or the most admired. But there was a certain stability in them. They moved with consistency. They ate with awareness. They slept with discipline. At the time, it did not seem dramatic. Yet decades later, those small patterns revealed their true power. Their joints remained cooperative. Their minds stayed clear. Their energy did not collapse under the weight of passing years. What they had done was not heroic. It was cumulative. Old age, I have learned, is less about the number of years you live and more about the biological environment you create inside yourself over those years. The heart does not suddenly weaken in one season. The arteries do not suddenly stiffen overnight. The brain does not suddenly lose its sharpness in a single moment. These changes are the slow result of metabolic negotiations that began long before wrinkles appeared. Each meal, each night of sleep, each hour of movement or stillness becomes part of a lifelong conversation between your choices and your physiology. So, if I speak to you now, it is not as a man standing at the end of life, but as someone who has watched the long arc of cause and effect. I want you to understand this one central truth. The habits you practice in youth are not temporary behaviors. They are instructions. They are messages sent repeatedly into the deepest systems of your body, shaping how resilient or vulnerable you will become when time begins to test you. The first real lesson my body taught me did not come from a doctor, a book, or a lecture. It came from fatigue. I was in my early 30s when I began to notice that exhaustion was no longer something that disappeared after one good night of sleep. It lingered, it accumulated. At first, I blamed work, stress, responsibilities, the usual explanations we give when life feels heavy. But slowly, I began to understand that what I was experiencing was not simply a schedule problem. It was a physiological pattern forming beneath the surface. My habits were shaping my internal chemistry in ways I had never consciously considered. When you are young, metabolism is flexible. It bends and compensates like a green branch in the wind. But flexibility is not permanence. Every repeated behavior leaves a biological imprint. If you consistently nourish your body with whole, balanced foods, your cells adapt by improving their efficiency. Mitochondria, the tiny energy engines within each cell, become more resilient. They learn to produce energy with less strain. But if you flood the system with excess sugar, ultra-processed fats, and irregular eating rhythms, the same adaptive intelligence works against you. The body becomes skilled at storing rather than using. It becomes practiced in inflammation rather than recovery. I saw this clearly in the men I worked alongside. Some treated food as fuel that deserved respect. Others treated it as entertainment without consequence. At 40, the difference was subtle. At 50, it was undeniable. One group climbed stairs with ease, while the other paused halfway to catch their breath. One group woke with clarity, while the other needed stimulants just to feel functional. These were not random outcomes. They were cumulative physiological negotiations that had been happening silently for decades. Movement played a similar role. In youth, physical strength feels like a natural inheritance. Muscles respond quickly. Joints tolerate misuse. But the body is always making long-term calculations. Bone density, for example, reaches its peak in early adulthood. If you do not challenge your skeletal system with regular load, walking, lifting, stretching, you are essentially telling your biology that structural strength is unnecessary. Years later, that message returns as fragility. I remember a friend who laughed at my commitment to simple daily exercise. He preferred comfort. At 75, a minor fall confined him to a hospital bed for months. It was not the fall that defeated him. It was the decades of unprepared physiology behind it. Sleep, too, revealed itself as a powerful architect of aging. For many years, I sacrificed rest in pursuit of productivity. Society often rewards this behavior. We admire endurance and hustle. Yet the nervous system keeps its own accounting. Chronic sleep deprivation disrupts hormonal balance, elevates stress chemistry, and interferes with the brain's nightly repair processes. Over time, this creates a terrain where anxiety grows easily and cognitive sharpness slowly erodes. When I finally committed to consistent restorative sleep, I felt as though I had discovered a hidden form of medicine, one that had always been available, but rarely prioritized. Stress was perhaps the most invisible influence of all. You cannot see cortisol circulating in your bloodstream. You cannot feel inflammation building quietly within tissues. But the body feels it. Every unresolved tension, every prolonged emotional strain subtly recalibrates your internal environment. In my middle years, I began practicing simple forms of mental stillness, quiet walks, deep breathing, moments of deliberate pause. These practices did not remove life's challenges, but they changed how my physiology responded to them. My heart rate steadied. My thoughts became less reactive. Over decades, this translated into a form of endurance that was both psychological and biological. What fascinated me most was how these systems, nutrition, movement, sleep, stress, did not operate separately. They formed an intricate network of influence. Poor sleep increased cravings for unhealthy food. Lack of movement amplified stress sensitivity. Chronic stress disrupted metabolic regulation. Each behavior either reinforced vitality or compounded vulnerability. Aging, I realized, was not a single process but the sum of countless interacting adaptations. By the time I reached my 60s, The evidence of this long-term conditioning was unmistakable. Some of my peers were already living within the limitations of chronic disease. They spoke of aging as though it were an unavoidable collapse. Yet I felt something different. Not immortality, but stability. My energy remained consistent. My mind retained curiosity. My body, though slower than before, responded with cooperation rather than resistance. This did not happen because I was special. It happened because decades earlier I began, imperfectly but persistently, to align my daily habits with the biological design of resilience. If there is one insight I wish I could deliver directly into the hearts of the young, it is this: the body is always preparing for the future you cannot yet see. It is recording your patterns with remarkable precision. Every choice becomes a small instruction shaping how gracefully you will meet the later chapters of life. You may not notice the effects immediately. In fact, you probably will not. But time is patient. It reveals the truth of your habits with undeniable clarity. As the decades continued to unfold, I began to understand that aging is not simply the passage of time. It is the visible expression of long-term biological agreements you have made with yourself. Some of these agreements are conscious: the decision to walk instead of sit, to eat with intention instead of impulse, to rest instead of constantly push. Others are unconscious, shaped by culture, convenience, and the subtle pressures of modern living. But whether conscious or not, the body accepts every repeated behavior as instruction. It reorganizes itself around the signals it receives most consistently. In my 70s, I became deeply aware of how early metabolic conditioning influences later resilience. By that age, the difference between individuals was no longer cosmetic. It was structural. Some hearts pumped with quiet efficiency, while others labored under decades of accumulated strain. Some minds processed information with clarity, while others struggled to recall simple details. These outcomes were not sudden malfunctions. They were the long-term consequence of how blood sugar had been regulated, how inflammation had been managed, and how cellular repair mechanisms had been supported or neglected since youth. I remember sitting in a clinic waiting room, surrounded by men my age. The atmosphere itself felt like a living lesson. Conversations revolved around medications, procedures, limitations. Many spoke as though their bodies had betrayed them. Yet I could not help noticing how their earlier lives had been marked by relentless overwork, irregular sleep, heavy meals consumed in haste, and years without meaningful physical activity. The body had not betrayed them. It had simply followed the trajectory that had been set in motion decades before. This realization was not judgmental. It was clarifying. It showed me that prevention is not a dramatic act performed once in a lifetime. It is a quiet discipline practiced thousands of times in ordinary moments. One of the most profound biological realities I observed was the concept of physiological reserve. When you are young, your organs operate with a wide margin of safety. The lungs can compensate for reduced capacity. The cardiovascular system can adjust to temporary imbalances. The brain can reroute functions with remarkable flexibility. But this reserve is not infinite. It is either preserved or depleted depending on how you live. Regular movement strengthens the heart's adaptability. Balanced nutrition stabilizes metabolic pathways. Restorative sleep maintains neural repair. Emotional regulation protects the nervous system from chronic overstimulation. These practices are not merely lifestyle choices, they are investments in future resilience. There was a period in my 80s when I faced a serious illness. It was the kind of challenge that forces you to confront the reality of mortality. During recovery, I became acutely aware of how my earlier decades of disciplined habits had created a foundation I could now rely on. My muscles, though aged, responded to rehabilitation. My cardiovascular endurance, though diminished, returned gradually. My mind remained capable of learning new routines. I realized then that healthy youth is not about achieving perfection. It is about building enough internal strength so that when adversity arrives, and it always does, your body has the capacity to respond rather than collapse. Another lesson revealed itself through observing the younger generations in my family. I watched them navigate a world filled with convenience and stimulation. Technology reduced the need for physical exertion. Processed foods became normal rather than occasional. Sleep schedules shifted unpredictably. Stress became a constant background presence. I did not criticize them. Instead, I shared stories, not to instill fear, but to illuminate cause and effect. I explained that biology does not negotiate with trends. It responds to fundamental principles. Muscles strengthen only when used. Metabolic systems stabilize only when nourished appropriately. Minds remain sharp only when rested and engaged with purpose. Perhaps the most empowering realization of all was understanding that small habits possess exponential influence over time. A daily walk may seem insignificant in the moment, but multiplied over 40 years, it becomes thousands of hours of cardiovascular conditioning. Choosing balanced meals most days of the week gradually shapes insulin sensitivity and inflammatory balance. Prioritizing sleep night after night preserves cognitive function far into later life. These actions do not produce immediate applause or visible transformation. Their power lies in their consistency. They operate quietly, like a long-term investment that matures beyond expectation. Now, at 97, I do not claim to have escaped the natural process of aging. My hair has thinned, my pace has slowed, and my body carries the marks of time. Yet I experience old age not as a sudden collapse, but as a gradual transition supported by decades of preparation. I can still walk independently. I can still hold meaningful conversations. I can still wake with a sense of curiosity about the day ahead. These are not small blessings. They are the biological dividends of habits formed when I was young enough to believe they did not matter. If I speak with conviction, it is because I have witnessed the alternative. I have seen how neglect accumulates just as powerfully as discipline. The human body is extraordinarily adaptive, but it is also profoundly literal. It becomes what you repeatedly ask of it. Youth offers you a rare window of opportunity, a period when the foundations of lifelong health can be built with relative ease. Whether that opportunity is used or ignored determines not only how long you live, but how fully you are able to inhabit the years you are given. If I could gather every young person into one quiet room and speak to them without interruption, I would not overwhelm them with medical statistics or frightening predictions. I would simply tell them what 97 years of living has revealed to me with undeniable clarity. The future health of your body is being written right now in the ordinary rhythm of your days. Not in grand resolutions that fade after a week, but in the small, repeated choices that shape your internal world in ways you cannot immediately see. Old age does not arrive as an isolated chapter. It grows slowly from the soil of your earlier habits. The strength of your bones, the flexibility of your arteries, the steadiness of your thoughts, even the emotional resilience that allows you to face loss and change, all of these are influenced by patterns established long before the first signs of aging appear. Youth is not only a time of opportunity for career or relationships, it is a critical biological season during which your body is quietly building its lifelong capacity to endure, adapt, and recover. Looking back, I realized that the most valuable decisions I made were not dramatic or heroic. They were simple acts of consistency, choosing to move when it was easier to remain still, choosing nourishment when indulgence was more tempting, choosing rest when ambition urged me to continue, choosing calm reflection when stress tried to dominate my thinking. These choices did not make headlines. They did not transform me overnight, but over decades they created a form of strength that has allowed me to experience old age with dignity rather than constant dependence. There is also something deeply liberating in understanding this cause and effect relationship. It removes the sense of helplessness that many people associate with aging. It reminds you that your body is not an enemy waiting to betray you. It is a responsive partner, continuously adapting to the signals you provide. When you respect its natural rhythms, it supports you. When you neglect them, it compensates for as long as it can, and then eventually reflects the accumulated imbalance. This is not punishment. It is simply the honest language of biology. I have lived long enough to see generations come and go, to watch societies change, technologies evolve, and priorities shift. Yet one truth has remained constant. Health is rarely lost or preserved in a single moment. It is shaped gradually, almost invisibly, through patterns that become destiny over time. If you understand this while you are still young, you possess an extraordinary advantage. You can build a future in which your later years are not defined by limitation, but by continued participation in life's simple joys, walking outdoors, thinking clearly, connecting with those you love. So I leave you with the same message I have shared with my children and grandchildren. Do not wait for discomfort or illness to force awareness upon you. Do not assume that strength will always be there simply because it exists today. Treat your daily habits as seeds. Plant them with intention. Care for them with patience. One day, perhaps many decades from now, you will stand where I stand, looking back with either quiet gratitude or quiet regret, and the difference between those two feelings will be determined not by chance but by the choices you begin making now.